Today we have the honor to host Dr. Camilla Harris from JPL. She studied the space environment of Jupiter's moon Europa through multi-fluid MHD simulations. So as I said, she's a NPP, a NASA postdoctoral program fellow working with Tom Nordheim. And today she will present the multi-fluid MHD modeling of Europa's plasma interaction. So thank you guys for being here, and thank you, Dr. Harris, for being here. Awesome.
Thank you, Vincent. I defended in November, so I'm still not used to people calling me doctor, but I always appreciate it. Right, so as Vincent said, I'm Camilla. I'm an NPP fellow at JPL, and during my dissertation at the University of Michigan, I developed a magnetohydrodynamic model for Europa's plasma interaction. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. We're going to start with a sort of broad introduction on why we care about Europa, coming a little bit from I've kind of tailored these talks to sort of explain to people who study the Earth's magnetosphere to then sort of translate that into what are we talking about with Jupiter's magnetosphere and its effects on this little moon. Then I'm going to explain some of the components of the MHD model that I worked on during my dissertation. And then I'm going to talk about some results where we looked at the effects of the magnetosphere sort of externally on this little plasma interaction. And then in the next project that I did where we're looking at effects of Europa's atmosphere on that plasma interaction, because the atmosphere is kind of the source of the ions in Europa's ionosphere. And then we'll wrap things up with the usual set of conclusions. So this animation was created by Corey Cochran at JPL. It's a sort of simplified model for Jupiter and the magnetic field of Jupiter's magnetosphere. What you see is that the magnetic field is represented with these kind of armature wires, and then the strength of the magnetic field is in color on the wires. Jupiter is rotating at the center, and then you have the inner magnetosphere, which is populated with, yes, excellent. You have this inner magnetosphere, which is populated with these moons, and this purple haze, which is representing Europa's plasma sheet. And then as you get away from the inner magnetosphere, you have the usual sort of distortions that we expect with a magnetospheric interaction with the solar wind. But for Jupiter, the single most important thing, I think, to understand when you're sort of translating this knowledge from the Earth is that in the inner magnetosphere, the rotation of this planet is king. The interaction with the solar wind does affect the outer parts of the magnetosphere, but not so much the inner, and so these field lines are still mostly dipolar. And the other thing is that Jupiter is a very quickly rotating planet. So when I say that Jupiter is dominating the inner magnetosphere, what I mean is that the rotation of the planet at about 10 hours is then causing the magnetic field to rotate and circulate throughout the inner magnetosphere. And it's also driving this rotation of the plasma sheet, which, as you can see, is tilted because the magnetic field is tilted with respect to the ecliptic or the orbital plane of the moons. So if we focus on this half, we can see this little blue moon here, and this is representing Europa. And if you stare at it for a few seconds, what you might notice is that Europa is orbiting much, much more slowly than the plasma and the magnetic field that's circulating around it. So we have this flow of magnetized plasma over the moon. That means that the magnetic field is changing in a periodic fashion with Jupiter's rotation. But also, if you stare at it for a few seconds, you'll see that the plasma is changing because this plasma sheet is rotating and passing over Europa, and then Europa is moving away from the center of the plasma sheet. And this time variation has two important consequences. So we have the periodic variation of the magnetic field, and you can see a snapshot of what that looks like at Europa over here on the right. And as I mentioned, we also have these variations in the density of the plasma. So this figure comes from a study by Fran Bagenal that was published in 2015, where they looked at what the Galileo spacecraft measured for electron density at different points along Europa's orbit. And what you see is that close to the plasma sheet center, you have these peaks. And then when you're away from the center of the plasma sheet, so in the lobes of the magnetosphere or at the farthest excursion, whatever you want to call it, there's like 5 different ways to say anything. You have this dip, this systematic dip in the electron density at Europa's orbit. So time-varying external boundary conditions is one consequence of this configuration of the magnetosphere. But then if you take things a step further, you get probably the main reason people are interested in Europa, which is the ocean-induced magnetic field. So Europa has an icy surface. Beneath that icy surface, you have an ocean. That ocean is a conductor, and so because you have this smoothly varying magnetic field over a roughly shell-shaped conductor, that produces a magnetic response to oppose that variation in the magnetic field. And you can see that in like the perturbations to the line as they tilt this way and that. So we've talked a little bit about sort of the context that Europa exists in the magnetosphere, but now I want to sort of take a much more closer step and look at what's happening to the particles around Europa, the stuff that is making up Europa's atmosphere and its ionosphere. So in this simplified view, we have Europa and this blue sort of haze representing a really tenuous atmosphere. We also have, as I mentioned, that flow of magnetospheric plasma, which is magnetized over the moon. The first process I want to talk about is sputtering. Sputtering has a whole body of literature behind it, and I'm going to reduce it to not even a full sentence. But for my purposes, sputtering is basically a black box where you put charged particles in, they strike the icy surface and impart it with some amount of energy, and you get neutral particles out. There's a lot more to it. And there are other processes which are important for generating the ionosphere, but I'm interested in this one because this kind of represents an interface between the plasma and the atmosphere. So this process produces molecular oxygen, which populates the atmosphere. That molecular oxygen can then be ionized through photoionization or electron ionization with electrons from the magnetosphere, and this produces a cold population of O+ and O2+. Those cold ions either sort of stick around and join Europa's ionosphere, or they can be pushed downstream in the ambient flow over Europa's flanks and join the plasma wake. So when we put all of that together, this is kind of what the whole interaction looks like. On the right, what you're seeing is a contour plot or in colors, of the ionosphere density in Europa's equatorial plane. So plasma is flowing again from left to right. As you see here, we see that the cool plasma is sort of existing in this envelope around Europa's surface, but then also it's been pushed downstream to join Europa's wake. And then we have this flow of the ambient plasma in the magnetosphere, which is roughly uniform farther away. But then as you get up close and personal with this plasma interaction, it gets diverted around Europa like a pole in a river, that kind of thing. But it's also important to remember that this is a plasma and we have magnetic fields threading through the whole interaction. So again, similarly, we have the magnetic field of Jupiter's magnetosphere, which is roughly uniform far away. And then as you get close to the plasma interaction, because those magnetic fields are frozen into the plasma and we have perturbations happening to the plasma, we also get twists and kinks in the magnetic field close to the moon. It's a sub-Alfvénic interaction. The magnetic field in Jupiter's magnetosphere is really high, about 400 nanotesla. The velocity of this flowing plasma against the interaction is about 100 kilometers per second in Europa's fixed frame. The densities that we're talking about are on the order of tens to hundreds per cubic centimeter for the magnetospheric plasma. And the main ion species that we're talking about in the magnetosphere are O+, S2+, and H+, and of course electrons. And this leads to an Alfvén Mach number of about 0.4. So we're definitely sub-Alfvénic. I think because of the variation in the magnetosphere, you're going to see a lot of variation in this Alfvén Mach number, but it's never going to be driven higher than 1. So why is this important and interesting, and how do we know all of these things about Europa? So we have this body of in situ data from the Galileo mission, which gave us several data sets looking at the magnetic fields along flyby trajectories close to Europa. We have some plasma data and some data on the energetic particles, and we have some information from the WAVES instrument, again, from Galileo. And we also have the new Juno flyby data, which is really, really exciting, and I'm really looking forward to being able to put those different components together and to find out what the interaction was doing on September 29th, but that's for future. We also have some remote observations. These are observations of Europa's oxygen aurora, again, from the Hubble Space Telescope. We have observations of the surface from Galileo, but all of these things are kind of sparse, and we don't really have anything like a comprehensive, continuous set of data for Europa and its plasma interaction, and I think that's where modeling comes in. It kind of helps us join up these disparate data sets. There's a whole body of work looking at modeling the atmosphere, but what I'm looking at today is the plasma interaction, its electromagnetic fields, and magnetohydrodynamics. And I mentioned all of these things happening with the different particles. You can't get away from it. I think to model this interaction correctly, you have to have some nod to the physical chemistry that's happening, all the ionizations, that sort of thing. And why are we doing all of this? We're doing it because of Europa Clipper and Europa Clipper's goals. So Europa Clipper, in about 10 years or so, is going to go to Europa, and it's actually going to provide that comprehensive and continuous data set. And the reason that it's doing that is to identify whether the conditions necessary for life, as we know it in the solar system, are present at Europa. And so in order to do that, as I mentioned earlier, you have to look at the subsurface ocean, and you have to, and one part of that is doing these magnetic sounding experiments, so looking at the electromagnetic fields and the induced fields at Europa. And so in order to understand that induced field, you have to understand everything else that's happening in the plasma and the magnetic field around Europa, and that's why this modeling is also important. So now I'm going to talk about the model. So as I mentioned, this is a magnetohydrodynamic model, and that's my favorite 5-syllable word. So the core conceit of magnetohydrodynamics is that you have these ensembles of charged particles, and you can model them as instead charged fluids. And this is really powerful because there's this whole body of computational fluid dynamics that you can now apply to the problem. You take a set of fluid equations like Navier-Stokes or something more sophisticated, and you add Maxwell's equations to acknowledge the fact that this is a charged fluid, and then you can, get all of these great results. That's why this kind of looks like a pole in a stream. The system size has to be much larger than the motions of the particles for this to work, and that's true for Europa. When I say the motions, the individual motions of the particles, I'm talking about the gyration, and that's on the order of like 80 kilometers. Europa is about 1,500 kilometers in radius, so we're good there. This is a model that was developed with BATS-RS, which is an MHD code at the University of Michigan. It's multi-fluid MHD, which means that I have different fluids all sort of coexisting with their own densities and momentums and stuff to represent different ions in the interaction. And we also include something called field-aligned electron heat conduction, which is basically modeling the heat reservoir that this gigantic magnetosphere provides without actually having to model a big old magnetosphere. We're just looking at this small interaction close to Europa. The simulation is run on a spherical mesh. So if you start in panel A, this is the most zoomed out view, and then you can zoom in to panel B and C and see these different levels of refinement we have to increase the resolution. And the reason that we do this is so that we don't spend a whole lot of time out on the boundaries solving this problem. We have nice big cells, they're easy to solve, but closer in we have cells that are small enough to resolve all of the variation, behavior, and gradients close to Europa's surface. These are steady state simulations, so they're not time dependent. They're kind of a snapshot of one moment. And just to give you an idea of how computationally expensive they are, I run these simulations on the NASA Pleiades supercomputer, and it takes anywhere between 8 to 12 hours to resolve those simulations depending on how many cores that I'm using, which is usually 1 or 2,000. So I said that this is a multi-fluid model. What I mean by that is that it has 3 ion fluids. Excuse me. So we're separately treating the thermal, ambient, magnetospheric plasma. You can see that the density is roughly uniform, far away, and then everything gets sort of piled up on the front side of the interaction, and then as the plasma flows to the right, there's these cavities because it's been obstructed and nothing's being generated there. On the other hand, we also have 2 fluids to represent Europa's ionosphere, that's O2 plus and O plus. And as I said on previous slides, you have this envelope of the ionosphere, then you have this wake, which is populated with various densities. Yeah, sure. Yes. Yes, they do. So there's kind of the MHD way that they interact in terms of like the advection and the flow, and one of them contributes to the pressure, which then changes the electrons, and then those electrons change all the fluids. But there's also what I'll get into on the next slide, which are some representations of the physical chemistry that's happening. And in particular, we have things like, oh, it's not on this slide, but we have like momentum exchange. So like if one plasma is very dense, you have momentum exchanged between the others in that location. But I would say that the coupling is a lot of it is through the electrons. And then a lot of it is also through these representations of the different chemistry, that sort of thing. So the point of this slide is to very briefly walk us through the process of how electron impact ionization is represented in the model, because I think that's kind of a key to understanding why the results look the way they do. So on the left, what we have is, this is basically the density of the atmosphere. This is a source population of static molecular oxygen. This is not something we're solving for. This is an input that we provide to the model. And then in the center, what we have is the electron temperature. So the electron temperature is calculated self-consistently as we develop the solution for these different ions in the simulation. And if we take that source population of static molecular oxygen and the electron temperature and the electron density in the model, from there, there we go. From there, that's how we calculate the mass loading rate to each of these different ion fluids. So yeah, that's kind of what I mean by everything goes through the electrons, because the different plasmas modify, for example, the electron density, and then that electron density goes back into these mass loading terms that then populate the ionosphere. So this is an example of what the results look like for one particular case. So what you're looking at, again, is the equatorial plane, X and Y. Plasma is flowing from left to right. In this coordinate system, Jupiter would be somewhere off in the ceiling. The colors are showing different components of the magnetic field. So we have the X component and the Y component, and then the Z component pointed into the page on the right. These streamlines are showing the flow of that ambient magnetospheric plasma in the simulation. And then this M is showing the dipole moments that we've prescribed in the model to represent Europa's induced field. So what we can see in the X and Y components of the magnetic field is mostly that induced field. So we have this red-blue pattern that we'd expect from a dipole, except everything's been kind of smeared out by the flow of that ambient plasma downstream. On the right, we're not seeing that sort of dipolar signature. Instead, what we're seeing is features that are more related to the plasma interaction itself. So I mentioned that the plasma is frozen into the magnetic field in this interaction. And so what that means is that when the plasma sort of gets piled up and stuck on the upstream side of the interaction, so does the magnetic field, and that causes the magnetic field strength to increase on the upstream side, where stuff is being slowed down and diverted around the moon. So they don't let you just make a model and then say it's right. You kind of have to prove it. So that's what I've got on this slide here. So this is a simulation that we did to represent the E4 Galileo flyby. You can see that trajectory in the plot on the left. It passed through Europa's wake, roughly in the equatorial plane. And on the right, again, we're seeing the X, Y, and Z components of the magnetic field, and then the magnetic field strength as a function of time along this flyby, which went in this direction from left to right. So I think this ties in really well with the last slide, because in the X and Y components of the magnetic field, what we're mostly seeing are signatures of the induced field, and I'll explain that. So in each of these panels, the solid black line is the smoothed out magnetometer data from Galileo. The red line is the magnetic field from the model along the same trajectory. And then this dashed line is the induced magnetic field that we prescribed in the model. And so what you can see is that the model and the data are basically showing that this induced magnetic field is just shifted downstream a little bit. And we've accurately captured that shift in the induced field. On the other hand, if we look at the Z component of the magnetic field, what we see is this decrease in magnetic field strength, which is pretty accurately matching what Galileo saw there. And so this gives me confidence that we can accurately model the plasma interaction in the wake. Yeah, sure.
Can you describe the difference between the black dashed line and the red curve? Are they both models?
So the red curve is the results of solving this interaction with all the plasma and that sort of thing. The black dashed line is what we prescribe in the model to represent Europa's induced magnetic field. So like Europa doesn't have an intrinsic dynamo. Instead, it has this induced field, and we prescribe it. So this is just dipolar. And you can see in the equatorial plane, we're not getting any response from that dipole because that's where the moment is directed. Yep, sure.
Do you expect the orientation of the induced field to change as a function of where Europa is in the plasma sheet?
Yes. And it's not so much because of the plasma sheet, I think. It's more just because you have that periodic variation of the magnetic field. So as I mentioned, the induced field is a response to that time variation. So if you think back to whenever you were made to take introductory electromagnetism, there's all these expressions for how when you have a time varying magnetic field in a conductor, that induces a response. Sure.
And just to clarify, I think following up on Rob's question, so the prescribed induced magnetic field, because you have it the way you have it, your final results from the model are matching nicely. And if you had prescribed that differently, your red model might not have fit as nicely with the data?
Yeah, yes, because I mean, you can see in this case that the red line it actually looks pretty much exactly like the black line, it's just shifted downstream. So the induced field is really important in the magnetometer observations that Galileo saw. So we've also done this with the E14 flyby, and the reason we chose this flyby is just because it goes through the upstream part of the plasma interaction. And I won't linger here too much, except to say that we also see a very good fit there, which indicates that the model is giving us reasonable results that we can safely draw some conclusions from. So that was a very quick tour of the MHD model, and now I'm going to talk about, like what are the science questions that we can actually answer with it. And the first question that we chose to look at is, how do all of these changes that I've talked about, these periodic variations in Jupiter's magnetosphere, control the precipitation of magnetospheric plasma onto Europa's surface? And I think this is an important question to answer because it's kind of at that interface between the plasma and the atmosphere. Because different models for the atmosphere have shown that this sputtering interaction with the thermal plasma can produce a significant amount of the neutrals in Europa's atmosphere. What you're seeing on this slide is a figure from Cassidy et al. In 2013, where they modeled the atmosphere using an analytic representation of the flow of the plasma, so sort of just a flat plane wave of plasma flowing against the surface. You get all of this precipitation producing O2 yield on the upstream side and nothing on the downstream side, and that's the end of the day. But I think the situation is a little more complicated than that, and so I think this is an interesting thing that the plasma has to say to the atmosphere. So just to recap what I talked about a little while ago, when we have that variation due to Jupiter's rotation, we have this simultaneous variation in the magnetic field and the plasma. So on the left, we have kind of a crude representation of the plasma sheet, and on the right, you have simultaneously what does the magnetic field look like. You can see that over 11 hours, we have this simultaneous variation where Europa is dipping away and towards the center of the plasma sheet, and also the magnetic field is changing at the same time. This is how the plasma varies there, and what's important, well, one of the important things you can pull out of this model is that you have these sort of, three different cases. So you have a case 1 situation where the magnetosphere, where the plasma in the magnetosphere is low density but hot in temperature, and then you have this case 3 where the density is high but the plasma is cooler. And so what that says to us is that you can have 3 different locations, and the external boundary conditions for the simulation should change depending on where Europa is in the magnetosphere. But those boundary conditions should also change according to what the state of the magnetosphere is. So if for some reason there's a lot of plasma in the magnetosphere, all of this plasma is generated from Jupiter's moon Io, there's volcanism, it produces 1/10 per second of neutrals, which then get ionized to fill up the magnetosphere. What if all the volcanoes went off at once? I don't think they do that, but what if they did once? Then the magnetosphere would be absolutely chock full of plasma, and you might have this case 3 situation. What's on this slide is just the inputs to the different simulations in the parameter study that I'm about to show you. So on the top, we have how the magnetic field varies throughout the magnetosphere, and then this is the density and the temperature. So this is a snapshot or a subset of the results from this parameter study. On each of these panels, what you're looking at is the XZ plane, or like kind of the equivalent to a meridional cut through the Earth's magnetosphere. The color is showing the velocity, or sorry, the speed of the plasma as it flows over Europa. So in particular, on the right, you can see what we call Alphane wings, where the plasma flows around Europa, but because it's frozen into the magnetic field, and the magnetic field lines that stretch from north to south have been slowed down by this interaction, the plasma also has to slow down. Each column is showing Europa at a different location in the magnetosphere. So on the right, we have Europa when it's at the center of the plasma sheet, and on the left, we have Europa when it's at its furthest extension, sort of excursion from that equator in the center of the plasma sheet. And then each row is showing the different cases for the state of the magnetosphere, where case 1 is the low density case, and case 3 is the high density case. Just a quick word on why these plots all look so different. It's simply because of that tilt in the magnetic field. So the plasma sheet cases, this plane is lined up with the magnetic field, but in these lobe and transition cases, you're kind of seeing a tilted sort of section through the interaction. So I said that we're interested in precipitation onto Europa's surface, and so that's what we extracted from each of these 9 different simulations in the parameter study. So in each of these panels, what you're seeing is Europa's geographic longitude, and on the y-axis, you're seeing latitude. The color is showing the precipitation of plasma onto Europa's surface, from the magnetosphere onto Europa's surface. So this is magnetospheric plasma. The pluses are showing the rand direction, so that's in most of these cases, that's where we see the highest intensity of plasma, because that's where the plasma is directly just flowing through the interaction without being diverted onto the surface. And then these sort of dark patches where we don't have any precipitation are on the leading or the downstream side of the moon. The contours are showing temperature. So for example, everything inside this orange contour is in excess of 100 electron volts. It's hotter than that. And I think it's important to think about temperature because this is the only sort of indication of the energy associated with this plasma. And that's important because if you're interested in sputtering, then this interaction and how much neutrals you get out of it is driven by the energy of the particle when it hits the surface. Yeah, sure.
Sorry. So when you're talking temperature here, are you talking ion temperature or electron temperature, or are you assuming they're equivalent?
This is the temperature of the magnetospheric ions.
Okay.
And I should mention this is a pretty simple calculation. This is just derived from the density and the pressure of the ion fluid.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, it's probably an ignorant question, but how can you explain this kind of little asymmetry with respect to the ram direction?
Yeah.
How can you explain that?
I think that's a great question, and my next slide answers it in detail. Yeah. So the main sort of preview of the end result of this project is that, so okay, if you integrate this intensity over the whole surface, then you get a precipitation rate, or the number of magnetospheric ions striking the surface per second. And simply put, the precipitation rate increases as we increase the density of the plasma in the magnetosphere. So as we move from the lobe to the plasma sheet, that integrated number of ions per second increases. And again, as we move from case 1, the low density case, to case 3 in the magnetosphere, it increases. But now this is the answer to Vincent's question. So what I've done is taken one of these panels and identified points A, B, C, and D, and then on the right, we have the streamlines associated with those points, which have been traced into the 3D simulation. So the A streamline, again, is mostly unimpeded. This is flow that is going to the surface with the minimum amount of deflection and interaction, and so it can sort of most efficiently deliver plasma onto the surface. The B field line, sorry, not field line, streamline, on the downstream side is sort of a parcel of very low density plasma, but it exists in this region where we have this strong J cross B force associated with the curvature of the magnetic field on the downstream side of the interaction, which is pulling plasma downstream and away from the moon's surface. One thing that I think is one result that I thought was really interesting from this study are the C and D field lines, because these are showing that we do have appreciable precipitation on the downstream side of the moon at mid latitudes. And the reason that this happens is because if you think about this plasma, which is streaming over Europa's surface, why doesn't it just continue downstream? And the reason is because there are gradients in the pressure. So as I mentioned, on the downstream side, there's nothing generating that magnetospheric plasma, and so you have this kind of vacuum that sucks plasma into the surface on the downstream side. So the ultimate result of this study is very simple and easy to explain. When you turn up the density in the magnetosphere, you get more precipitation. Great. But if you break that down by location and also by the state of the magnetosphere, then I think you sort of start to build up a way to predict what those inputs to the sputtering that then contributes to the atmosphere are going to be for any given location in the magnetosphere. Oh, yes, please.
On the previous slide, on the wake, there is like a vacuum. That's what causes the pressure to push. But in even an earlier slide, you said that in the wake, there's a higher density of the other types of ions. So
right. So the pressures are kind of separated, like the pressure gradient that's important for the magnetospheric so the question is, like, why do we have this pressure gradient if there actually is a lot of plasma here? It's just that cold, dense ionospheric plasma. And the answer is just that, like, when you're solving these equations, and so, like, the model asks, okay, well, what's the force from pressure that this ambient magnetospheric plasma fluid is feeling? That's primarily caused by the density of that particular fluid. So because they're separate fluids, that's why we get this effect. Yes, it'll be exciting to see if that bears out. So now we're going to talk about the neutral atmosphere. So what we've done with this project is conducted another parameter study to explore the plausible range of, I've called it variability in Europa's atmosphere, but the simplest way to say it is just that there are constraints on the column density of this neutral atmosphere, but they admit a lot of different configurations within them. And the people who develop plasma models have kind of just had a lot of freedom to choose the one that works the best for their model, because there's not a whole lot of observations that say, no, you have to use this scale height. And so what I wanted to do with this parameter study is just use one model, limit the variation of the other parameters, and see what happens when we vary those different choices for the atmosphere. So we have 9 different cases for the state of the atmosphere within this parameter space, which is spanned by these contour lines which define constraints on the column density. We also included 2 different cases for the state of the magnetosphere, because as we saw in the last project, that's really important. And this results in a parameter study with 18 different simulations in it. So this is, again, a subset of what those results look like. And what you're seeing is the density of O2+ in Europa's ionosphere for those 9 different atmosphere configurations. So again, plasma is flowing from left to right. In the top row, we have the simulations with the highest or the longest scale height of about 300 kilometers. In the bottom row, we have simulations with a much smaller scale height, which is kind of more what models for the atmosphere predict. And then, you know, we have a case somewhere in the middle, and I feel like most things in science, a lot of the times they end up being somewhere in the middle. In each column, we have different surface densities for the atmosphere, and the top row is probably the easiest place to see those increase, but I think you see the most significant effects from changing the scale height, because that's where sort of the breadth of the ionosphere changes. And it's important to remember for the plasma that the moon itself is not the obstacle you're thinking about. The obstacle is this distribution of plasma. So anything that causes the ionosphere itself to be larger is what's actually going to change the interaction. So this is the low magnetospheric plasma density case, and then this is what these look like for the high magnetospheric plasma density case. You see some kind of interesting structure in these cases, but I would be very cautious about drawing conclusions from them, just because these are the absolutely most extreme simulations in the study, and they're probably more of an edge case or an upper boundary than something that's actually likely to happen. So again, this is what the magnetic fields look like in those different simulations. The color is showing the Z component of the magnetic field, so the component which is directed southward into the plane. And then the lines are showing the flow of the ambient plasma of the magnetosphere. And you can see that in these simulations with high scale height, the plasma has been diverted really far away from the surface. But then as you decrease the scale height, that diversion is less efficient. And similarly, you can see as you increase the density of the plasma, you get a denser ionosphere, and that causes these perturbations to the magnetic field, which are sort of telling you how strong the interaction is. This causes those perturbations to be stronger. And then this is what it looks like for the high magnetospheric plasma density case. Really hard to get these 2 on the same color scale.
So,
sure. Can I
ask a question? So by looking at where these perturbations begin,
right,
could you use that to estimate, at least to me, and I think you'd agree, it looks like you can use that to actually estimate the scale height of the oxygen atmosphere.
Yeah, that would be an interesting project. So like, yeah, if you had a really small scale mission with only a magnetometer, you could make some interesting, if you had enough, well, all right, so you need the right trajectory, right? You need something that, oh geez. You need something that sort of goes, something that passes through the upstream. But I'm really sorry for anyone online. I think that.
Take your time. Yeah. Do you need some water?
Yeah, actually, I'm going to turn off the microphone for a second.
covering. I'll just make a point that you don't really need to respond to, but we know O2 is the major constituent globally, but Lawrence Roth has a nice paper showing water near the subsolar point varying with time as well. We know there's a little bit of atomic oxygen in there too, so I'd be really hesitant about concluding the scale height of O2 based on magnetometer data alone, and there are lots of different constituents to fold into a model with the neutral atmosphere before we sort of understand the whole picture.
Yeah,
Do these simulations include the induction field?
Actually, no. So for this particular set of simulations, the background magnetic field is perfectly aligned with the z-axis. And so because we're modeling the situation where the change in the magnetic field is minimized, it's consistent to not include the induction response because you kind of don't have that time variation. Just to very briefly talk to Kurt's point, because I think it's really important, having one set of measurements is always going to fool you because, like, there's usually more than one way to get the same result. So, like, for example, Alfvén number, or the Alfvén Mach number, is a really good way to characterize, like, the Alfvén wing angle. But there's different combinations of the plasma density, and speed, and magnetic field that'll give you the same, roughly the same Alfvén wing structure. So, yeah, I think that's kind of the sort of same kind of problem that Kurt was getting at. But I think combined with other measurements, that would be a really interesting experiment. So we've also done a little bit of validation of the simulations in this parameter study because we don't really have basically we've generated all of these different possibilities for the ionosphere. How do we know that they're any kind of realistic? And Galileo provides a data set that we can look at to kind of test that. So what we're showing on the left are radio occultation profiles of the ionosphere, so electron density. And the main thing that I drew away from this is that you have a lot of variability. These profiles come from different points over Europa's surface, so that can explain some of it, but they also come from different points in time. On the right, what we have are different altitude profiles drawn from different rays around Europa's surface. And we can see a kind of similar amount of variability where we have things peaking at about 10,000 per cubic centimeter close to Europa's surface and then falling away within the first 100 or so kilometers. These are the cases for the low magnetospheric plasma density. This is what they look like for the high magnetospheric plasma density, and the y-axis has changed just because if it's on a linear axis, everything's kind of on top of itself. But again, you can see similarly, here's that 10,000 mark, and most of these simulations are producing ionospheres that are bounded by that. It's just the most extreme cases that are exceeding this. And we do see this really similar sort of behavior of like peaking close to the surface, falling off within the first few hundred. So I think this sort of qualitatively says that the amount of variability we're seeing in the model is not unrealistic for Europa. So again, we're still interested in precipitation onto Europa's surface. So what we did was looked at how plasma is diverted away from the surface, because the plasma which is diverted is the stuff that's not contributing to the precipitation. So if the ionosphere was not there and Europa was just a ball in space, nothing would be diverted, and everything in Europa's cross-section upstream would just flow into the surface, and that would be the end of the story. But because the ionosphere is the obstacle, and because it's conducting, and we have all this interaction with the magnetic fields, we have streamlines that flow around Europa and don't hit the surface. And what we're interested in is the percent of those streamlines which are diverted away. So in the first parameter study, all of the results pretty much fell on this line at about 88%, plus or minus 2%. So when we're not changing the atmosphere, we get pretty much the same number of streamlines hitting the surface, And the reason that the precipitation rate was still different is because of the density of the plasma carried on those streamlines. But in this parameter study, the result is very different. We see plus or minus 10% variability in the diversion of streamlines, and that is primarily what's controlling the precipitation rate of plasma onto the surface. So just to sort of show you in plots what that looks like, what I just said, these are two cases from the first parameter study. You can see that even though the density on these streamlines is different, the flow pattern looks pretty much the same, and the thing that's making the difference is the density on the streamlines. On the other hand, in this second parameter study where we have different atmospheres, this is the most extreme case with high scale height. We see that all of these streamlines are pushed away, so even though the density of the plasma is pretty similar, because we just have less streamlines delivering plasma onto the surface, that's why we get these changes in the precipitation rate. Yes? Yeah, so the difference is that in this parameter study, we're varying the density and the temperature of plasma in the magnetosphere. In this parameter study that I'm talking about, we varied the magnetosphere a little bit, but the bulk of this variation is caused by the difference in the atmosphere. Yeah. So I'm coming to the end here. Basically, what this means is that the precipitation rate decreases quickly as you increase the column density of Europa's atmosphere. So if Europa's atmosphere has a nominal state, it's somewhere on this chart, and you can see that if the column density is relatively low, if you still have changes in there, you do still expect to see changes in the precipitation of plasma onto the surface. And I think that's really interesting because if you do have that variation, then you have the potential for a feedback loop between the plasma and the atmosphere, whereas the atmosphere, like say the density increases for some reason, that's going to then restrict the precipitation of plasma onto the surface because it's more efficiently shielded, and maybe that causes the atmospheric density to then back off. So this is something which I didn't talk about in the papers, but given the recent Juno flyby, I think it's important to emphasize this point. Well, what are the effects of the state of the atmosphere on the magnetic fields? So what I did was I identified 4 of the most realistic atmospheres in this study, and I flew 2 trajectories through these simulations, and then I extracted the magnetic field data from them. Sorry, I said 4. I meant 4 atmospheres, actually 8 simulations. So the dashed lines are showing the cases for high magnetospheric plasma density. The solid lines are showing the cases for low magnetospheric plasma density. And then this is the 30-kilometer trajectory, which is more similar to what we'll get with the best trajectories for Europa Clipper. This is the 300-kilometer trajectory, which it's not in the same place, but it's kind of more analogous to what we might see with the Juno flyby. And the important thing about this chart is that if you look at the magnetic fields, the difference between each of these dashed curves, for example, is just in the atmosphere. And what that means is that if you look at the envelope for these curves, the data might be anywhere inside them if you don't know what the atmosphere is doing. So I think when we see that magnetometer data, and if I get the chance to model it in the future, knowing the atmosphere is going to be really important for getting things right. So just really quickly to wrap things up, I talked about an MHD model that I developed during my PhD. We looked at the variability and the precipitation of plasma onto the surface due to conditions in the Jovian magnetosphere. We also looked at variability due to different possible states of the atmosphere. And if you put the 2 of these together, I think you get a really comprehensive understanding of the variability in the plasma interaction, which is good because that was the title of my thesis. So thank you, everyone. Europa Clipper is going to take some great in situ measurements. There's also going to be some great remote measurements, and models are going to help us put them together. So.
That was a really great talk. Yeah, really great work. Do we have any questions in the room? Yes.
Yeah, see Tracy.
Yeah, fantastic talk. So I know your focus has been mostly on how the atmosphere can affect the interactions between the atmosphere and the magnetic field modeling that you're doing. But since you did have a nice prediction of sort of where the ions are really impacting on the surface, do you see that correlation with some of the surface colorations in some of the visible maps, or maybe what you expect we'll see with Europa Clipper remote sensing data?
Let me go back to the slide where I showed those. Cursor, where's my cursor? I don't know where it is. Okay. Woo! All right, these. So I have not done that exact comparison, but I think there's a leading trailing difference, right? You definitely see that here. In all of the cases, you have the most precipitation on the trailing hemisphere or the upstream hemisphere. You have the least precipitation or none on the leading hemisphere. So.
Yeah, and I think where it'll be even more, I think where your models will become really interesting is some of the other variations that you're seeing in terms of like temperature and things like that. So like, yeah, the general leading trailing dichotomy, but some of the stuff about kind of where you're seeing things sort of always be sort of on the southern part of the trailing versus the northern part, and I wonder how that might play out.
Yeah, that's a good point, because like in particular, if you look at these simulations, I could not tell you why exactly we have that north-south asymmetry, except that it must have something to do with the sort of intrinsics of the interactions between the different fluids, because the magnetic field is symmetric with respect to, no, you know what, that's not the case, sorry. It's tilted, but like in the x direction, so it's like aligned in the xv plane. So there is a little bit of a tilt there, but it should like average out over the course of the whole thing. So.
That precipitation rate is in long scale, so those features are small.
Sorry, I can't hear you so well.
I'm just saying the scale is in long scale.
Right.
So those things that you're seeing there are really
big difference.
low intensity compared to, so whether you would see that on the surface or not, I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point, and this is the most interesting slide to me. With our Hubble observations, as Europa goes in and out of the plasma sheet, we see one hemisphere lit up more so than the other most of the time, but there are exceptions to the rule, and those exceptions are puzzling. But if there's something else coupled in to sort of drive an atmospheric asymmetry north-south in this really kind of convoluted way that you're showing on the screen here, that might help us tie in what we're seeing in the Hubble imagery, is my first thought. And
yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, if there's like something going on in the magnetosphere that's not related just to like your location.
Or if there's just more atmosphere there to be glowing in the first place, that would show up in our data.
Yeah. Sure.
So you're showing there electron temperatures between 100 and 250, so there's quite a variation.
Yeah, sorry, that's the ion. That's the ions. That's the ions in the magnetosphere.
What about the electron temperatures? Is it varying similarly?
Good question. So the electrons that we're modeling here in these simulations are always going to be the thermal ones, just because that's what we're looking at for the MHD modeling. I know that what we specify is 20 eV in the model, so it's going to be something
But you mentioned
probably cooler than that, I think.
that they're highly conductive or some connectivity along the field lines as well. So.
Yeah, and that mostly serves to provide energy for all the interactions that we have going on, like close to Europa, where the temperature would normally be very low, but we have this heat conduction, which is sort of funneling energy into that.
And the mass loading rate you mentioned earlier is a function of that electron
yeah, it's a function of the electron temperature, the electron density, and also the density of the neutrals.
Yeah, so related to this flux tube content and conductivity topic, if you could flip to the slide where you show a top-down view of some of the streamlines, you have
Yeah.
slide or two forward, I think.
No, you know what, that was
Or back.
this one, right?
Yeah, like for that magnetic field line that's carrying these flux tubes A to B, basically.
Mhm.
You know, the electrons are pummeling into one hemisphere or the other, or
Yeah.
or not the other in terms of this conductivity. So flux tubes are depleted on one hemisphere, but not so much the other. And is there some way for you to account for that in your modeling, I wonder? Because that really explains the aurora that we see.
Oh.
Flip-flopping back and forth, just that depletion.
Yeah, so like a time varying heat conduction.
Yeah, because
I
you
gotta
know
say-
the speeds and everything along the line.
Yeah, I gotta say, the heat conduction adds a significant amount of complexity to the model, and so it's not something that we've looked at, but it's an interesting question. And also, these are steady-state simulations, so maybe that kind of reduces the
I'll
complexity
send
of
you
it.
my 2003 paper where I came up with a really sort of easy analytical approach to maybe just
Yeah,
folding that in differently. So
Yeah.
maybe that'll help you.
yeah, I'll think about that. Thank you. Oh, sorry.
Do we have any?
So, you have time for one more. So you're imposing a fixed atmosphere,
Yes.
right? It doesn't feed back with the model either in the source from the surface or the loss.
Yes,
through plasma.
that's correct. So that is where, that's where sort of the physicality breaks down. The density is the same regardless of how much we're taking out of it. It's just resolving to a steady state simulation where we assume that it's like supplying as much as we're taking.
All right.
Other people have questions on the line? We have a few people calling in, so if you have a question, just go ahead. Well, I guess there's no questions, so thank you again.
Thank you.